we have one of our longest standing artificiality-ites talking next, Steve Sloman. Very special place in my heart with his book. I found his book quite late after it was written, actually, and it was really at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was finding the pandemic just a little stressful, so I decided to do a bit of a sabbatical on human decision making. I thought that might add to my AI sort of skills, and went down the rabbit hole with his book, and it's since become an absolute cornerstone of all of the decision-making work that we do with clients. And parts of his book I think I've literally memorized. I know Dave can rattle off his slides and many of the logic stories and puzzles and tests and illusions. And it's an absolute delight to have him here. And this is actually the first time we've met in person, even though we've spent a lot of time talking. So I'll hand it over to you, Steve.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Dave told me I was much shorter than he expected. No, he didn't. So that last talk was pretty amazing, the last pair of talks, and it's a hard act to follow. But the one thing, I flew in from the East Coast yesterday. I don't know whether to be high or low. I'll try high. If I fall off, then forgive me, please, and try to catch me. I flew in from the East Coast yesterday, and the first thing I noticed was how nice people are here. They're just so nice. So thank you, Helen and Dave, for producing this nice culture, or bringing us to this nice culture. Hopefully it'll last for at least 45 minutes. We'll see. Okay, so we are talking about AI, which means we're talking about information. And we all know that it's now an information economy, that information reigns, right? That what we want is more and more information, because it'll save the world, right? If we have all the right information, then we'll solve medical problem after medical problem, and we'll solve economic problem after economic problem, and everything will be great. Or, as Yuval Noah Harari puts it, we live with this naive assumption, right? This naive assumption that information leads to truth, and that truth leads to improvement. So, of course, there is another perspective that we've all come across, especially since the letter written by the AI gurus about the potential dangers of machine learning and AI. In fact, there was a paper published in January of this year, a survey of 2,800 AI researchers, and it turns out the vast majority of them think there's a 5% chance that modern AI will destroy humanity. So there's a real question about the value of information. So I think it's worth pondering for a moment what we mean when we talk about information. What is information? Is it data? Is it the bits that sit in your computer and my computer and in the cloud? Is it facts? Right? Here's an interesting fact that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, was in Vietnam in '68. Here's a photo of him, and this was before he started covering his tattoos with cardigans. This is total BS, right? Mr. Rogers did not have tattoos. There's no need to cover them with cardigans. So is that information? Another possibility is that when we talk about information, what we really are talking about is that structured kind of knowledge that serves as explanations, that serves as schematic knowledge that we use in order to make inferences and make predictions and understand things. right? Maybe that's what's needed for information. Or maybe we need it in its more human form of stories, right? Maybe that's what constitutes information. Or maybe it's all of these things. I don't know. So here's what I think. I think there's a really important distinction to be made between data and information, right? There are warehouses full of data. Most of it is useless. Most of the surveys I fill out, I know nobody's ever going to look at the answers. And I don't think those constitute information in any important sense. So to be information, it has to be used, and to be used, then it has to make a difference to something. So sometimes information makes a difference because a machine reads it. So there are strings of zeros and ones that machines can make use of. I can't, but they do get used, and thus they are information. What I want to focus on today is what people consider information. What constitutes information for people? So here's the first thing to know about people. People aren't storage devices. Famous cognitive scientist named Tom Landauer, who did this back-of-the-envelope calculation many years ago, and based on data from memory experiments where people are asked to remember lists of words, he calculated how much information the human brain can retain. And his answer was 1 gigabyte. Yeah. Well, a lot less than a few 100,000 copies of that book, I'll tell you, right? So this thumb drive can hold about 16 gigs, and so that's 16 times the capacity of the human brain, according to Tom Landauer. So we're not made to store information. I think what we're made to do is extract deeper principles of things for new situations. And I suppose, come to think of it, that that's not so unlike what Michael Levin was arguing in the first hour today, or at least it's consistent with what Michael Levin was arguing. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's ignorance all around us, right? A 2012 NSF survey found that 25% of Americans don't know that the Earth revolves around the sun, rather than vice versa. And this is not a new phenomenon. In 1943, only 25% of college freshmen knew that Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War. So late night comedians make hash out of this fact constantly. Walk down the street and ask someone to name, say, a Supreme Court justice, right? Very few people can do it. I think this is really important with regard to understanding our society today. So you may have heard that there are some culture wars that have been going on for a little while now. And there's at least a couple of ways to think about those culture wars. One is that the problem with the other side is that they don't know enough. Right? There's a deficit in their knowledge. And if we can just fill that gap, shove the appropriate information into their skulls, then the problem will be solved. But there's another view, which is that it has nothing to do with information. And the reason people believe what they believe is because of their social identity, that they accept what they're told by the people they care about, by the people that they want to affiliate with. So is it about social identity, or is it about lack of knowledge? So the lack of knowledge view is often referred to as the deficit model, right? And I would say that the deficit model is the idea that we all carry around with us. It's kind of our basic default assumption about people, about what's right with them and what's wrong with them. And it's not only the lay view, I think it's the scientific view too. I think most psychologists, for instance, and sociologists and philosophers also see the world in terms of the deficit model. In fact, any time you talk about an information bubble or an echo chamber, you're assuming the deficit model. You're assuming that what matters is the transmission of knowledge in order to form opinion. Whenever you talk about an information campaign, like if you think that the best way to get people to take a vaccine is to inform them about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine, then you're assuming the deficit model. Or if you think we can solve the problem of, say, fake news by giving people critical reasoning skills, then you're assuming the deficit model, right? You're assuming it's about information. Here's one way to see the problem with the deficit model. We've been talking a lot about bicycles since we began yesterday. I don't know if you've noticed, but how many of you think you could draw a bicycle accurately? Accurately. I see a lot of hands being raised, and I see others wondering if they should raise their hand. Just so that the parts are in the right locations. It doesn't have to be a nice drawing. I just want the parts to be in the right locations. I want you to accurately represent the causal structure of a bicycle, basically. Okay, so I was planning to actually run the exercise, but then I was told I have much less time than I thought. So let me tell you that some of you can do it. I have absolutely no doubt. I just learned that Helen was a professional cyclist at some point, so I hope she can do it. But, although it would be really, have you tried?
Just because I can ride it doesn't mean I can do it.
Yeah. So this woman, Rebecca Lawson at the University of Liverpool, ran this study, and she asked people to draw bicycles. Here's the kind of thing she got. This bike would be hard to ride, right? The chain is not even touching the wheels. This one's a little better, but if the chain's connected to the front wheel, it's going to be hard to turn. And notice the pedals aren't connected to the chain at all, or the wheels. Here's another similar one. This one's better, right? The chain is connected to the back wheel and the pedals to the chain. That's all right for those of you. That's good. But you'd have to be a chimpanzee, right, to ride this bike. So people have trouble with even this task. And notice the thing about a bicycle is that the whole causal mechanism, all the mechanisms on a bike are visible. And we see them all the time, especially if you live in Bend, right? They're like everywhere. And yet, there's a kind of lack of understanding of how the thing works. So in general, it turns out that people think they know more than they do about how things work. This was first demonstrated by a couple of psychologists at Yale, Leon Rosenblatt and Frank Kyle, with artifacts, common everyday artifacts. My colleagues and I showed it with political policies, right? That people think they understand the effectiveness of political policies better than in fact they do. The way you show these things is by asking people how well they think they understand, and then say, okay, now tell me, how does it work? Explain it in as much detail as you can. And what the people themselves find is that they can't explain it. So when you ask them again to rate their understanding, their judgment is lower. They themselves have their illusion of understanding punctured. So we called the book we wrote about this The Knowledge Illusion. And one implication is that opinion doesn't require knowledge, right? So just because people couldn't explain the effectiveness of policies, how they worked, it didn't mean they didn't have opinions about them. Asking them to explain how they worked did reduce the extremity of their opinion. In that sense, we sort of depolarized these people a little bit. But beforehand and 10 minutes afterwards, they were back to their sense of hubris about what it is they knew and believed. Okay, so we have these limited knowledge bases. and yet we get around the world. We make decisions all the time. How do we do it? Well, we have a number of simplifying tricks. Right? So one trick we've known for a long time, that is we use simplifying heuristics in order to make judgments and decisions. And we could spend a long time talking about what those heuristics are. But I want to focus on a couple of other things. So here's another thing we do. Instead of trying to understand things, we base our judgments on sacred values. So despite my lack of time, I'm actually going to devote a little bit of time to this because I think this is a really cool demonstration that was inspired by some work by a great psychologist named Phil Fernbach at University of Pennsylvania. So bear with me for a minute. Here's the first vignette. Imagine that you only have 50 bucks. And the neighbor who just lost their job comes by and says she needs $50 to buy a meal plan for her child. Otherwise, her child will not have lunch at school. Can you give her the money? You ask two friends for their advice. Frankie thinks about it for quite a while and then finally advises you to give your neighbor the money. Charlie hardly thinks at all, advising you immediately, give your neighbor the money. Who would you say is more morally praiseworthy? Frankie or Charlie? How many of you think Frankie is? How many think Charlie is? So I, and most people who get this problem, agree with Charlie. He didn't think at all, right? This is a choice between a sacred value, saving a neighbor's child, or at least feeding a neighbor's child, versus 50 bucks, a material entity. And in a case like that, I would say, go with the sacred value. In fact, Tetlock calls these taboo trade-offs, right? Because you're not supposed to trade off a sacred value with a material entity. That's wrong-headed, almost evil. Sacred values are absolute. We're supposed to feed our neighbor's children, and that's something we're supposed to do regardless of the material cost to us. As opposed to, here's a different kind of trade-off. So same story, neighbor comes, needs money for her kid, but there's a problem. You just got a text from an old schoolmate asking to borrow $50 to buy the medication he needs to cure a serious illness. You only have 50 bucks, so it's one or the other. You ask two friends for their advice. Frankie thinks about it for quite a while and then advises you to give your neighbor the money. Charlie hardly thinks at all, advising you immediately to give the neighbor the money. On the basis of their advice, who would you say is more morally praiseworthy, Frankie or Charlie? Now how many say Frankie? Frankie wins. How many think Charlie? Couple? Okay, so in this case, most people say Frankie. Why? Well, Frankie thought about it. And Frankie, he or she, had to, or they, had to think about it because it's a hard call. It's what Tetlock calls a tragic trade-off between two sacred values. Should you save the child or should you save your friend? Not easy, so you have to deliberate. And in fact, deliberation in this case is a sign of moral rectitude. Okay, so the point of these things for me is that there's a kind of psychological reality to sacred values, right? I don't think I'm just making up the idea that a sacred value is different from another kind of value, and that making decisions by sacred values is special, or at least different from making decisions based on the consequences of the decision, right? Okay. So, a couple of points to make about sacred values. First of all, when I say sacred, I don't necessarily mean religious, right? Like, I don't think the example I just showed you requires one to be religious in order to value saving a neighbor's child. So sometimes people call them protected values in order to get away from this religious connotation. I like the term sacred values. I think it captures the meat of the idea more directly. What's special about sacred values is that they refer to actions. Usually when we talk about values, or when we talk about utilities, we're talking about the utilities of outcomes, right? We're talking about the consequences of a decision. Sacred values aren't about consequences. In fact, they tell you to ignore the consequences and to focus only on the goodness of the action. And, as I've already pointed out, they're absolute. They don't admit of trade-offs, at least trade-offs with consequences. So the thing about sacred values is they're really persuasive. They're really easy to talk about, right? And they simplify choice. Like if you think that the right thing to do is to save your neighbor's child by feeding him or her, then you just do it. And you don't really think about what that entails, what the consequences are to you, what the consequences are to the child or the parent or your friend who happens to be sick, right? You just take this action. It's a straightforward prescription. So communities really love them. And in fact, I have this book coming out in December, I hope, called The Cost of Conviction, which is about how sacred values lead to high levels of outrage by virtue of making people feel like they understand situations, and that these feelings of outrage lead people to be unwilling to compromise, to be intransigent in their views, and also a willingness to act. In other words, I think our focus on sacred values is the cause of many of our social ills today, right? And if we could only focus more on boring, difficult, complicated consequences, we might have less polarization as a society and be happier for it. Okay, so that's two ideas about simplifying decision making, right? One is using heuristics, the other is relying on sacred values. The third is an answer to the question, why is it that people think they understand things better than they do? And the answer I'd like to provide is because other people understand, and we don't distinguish ourselves from other people. In other words, we live in a community of knowledge. Knowledge is not something that sits inside the skull, right? We've seen this many times already in the past couple of days. Knowledge is something that sits in a community, and it's not really important to know whether you personally know it. What's important to know is whether the community knows it. And communities do know how bicycles work. So there's a sense in which everybody knows how bicycles work because we can draw on our community. So we outsource many of our decisions, judgments, questions, problems to our community. And that's sort of the ultimate way to simplify a decision, right? Not make it at all. Ask others to make it for you. So, how am I doing for time? Okay. So here's a little very direct evidence for the power of these kinds of communities. Many of these communities come in the form of ideological communities. Like, one fact about people is that when you hear that other people understand, then that increases your own level of understanding, right? Because you now have access to knowledge that you didn't otherwise have. But the implication of that is you might hear that other people understand, and that increases your level of understanding, but why do those people think they understand? Well, maybe it's because they've heard that others around them understand, and those others might think they understand because, right, you get the picture. You could have a whole community with this high level of understanding because they've been mutually reinforcing each other, even though there's no true understanding. It's actually a house of cards. And in my mind, that's really what an ideological community is. So when the pandemic broke out, some colleagues and I did a study in which we asked people how they felt about COVID-19 prevention and mitigation procedures. Do they socially distance? Do they wear masks? This was prior to vaccines, but how did they feel? Were they planning to get vaccinated? And we also asked them a slew of questions about how well they understood COVID-19 and demographic characteristics about themselves, and everything under the sun. And what we found was that the best predictor, I don't think this will surprise anybody actually, the best predictor of their attitude towards COVID-19 mitigation procedures was their political partisanship, right? If they were Republicans, they were against. If they were Democrats, they were for. And in fact, in later work, so Mae Fullerton was an honors thesis student of mine at Brown, and so she ran this survey in October of 2020, and what we found was that even if you looked at people's susceptibility to risk, like if they were immunodeficient, it was still the case that their political partisanship determined their attitudes more than anything else. So that's the power of a community, right? That it determines this life or death kind of issue. All right, back to information. So what form does information take in a community? And I'm not the first to believe that the primary form that it takes is the form of a narrative, right? Different communities have different underlying narratives. We have stories that we tell each other that are based on a rather abstract set of values and set of beliefs about how the world works, but they come in the form of a story. So, for instance, if you consider what's happening in Ukraine, some people, especially in the West, believe that Russia unleashed an illegal war on a friendly neighbor. But if you go to Russia or talk to other people in the West, they have a completely different narrative. Their narrative says that Ukraine is Russia, and the invasion of the Ukraine is an attempt to return that part of the world to its natural state. So depending on what your underlying attitude is, you're going to have very different perspectives on whether the US should give money to support Ukraine, how you feel about the actions of Zelensky, etc. It determines basically everything you believe about what's going on. So to try to put this all together, I'm going to try to answer this question. How should we frame issues if we want to get along well with other people and maximize the effectiveness of our actions? So, first thing, for information to be effective, it has to fit the listener's narrative. If it doesn't fit the listener's narrative, it's useless. It's going to go flying above their heads, right? If I say Putin is Stalin, then that's going to be meaningless to someone who believes that Putin is restoring Russian greatness. So information has to fit the narrative of your listener. Second, you have to acknowledge other people's sacred values. You don't have to agree with them, but if you're communicating with someone, you have to let that person know that you know where they're coming from, right? You're not going to be able to negotiate with America or any other Western nation unless you acknowledge that the rules of war are valid. You're not going to be able to negotiate about war unless you acknowledge that the rules of war are valid. Which isn't to say that the West necessarily respects the rules of war, right? It's just that it thinks it does, or argues from the perspective of believing in the rules of war. And that has to be acknowledged. If someone denies it or refuses to acknowledge it, then you're not going to talk to them. And then third, you've got to talk in terms of causes and consequences, because that can reduce hubris and open people to compromise, right? So this is an allusion back to the knowledge illusion, the fact that you can puncture people's inflated sense of understanding by asking them to explain, by asking them to spell out causes and consequences. So get people to think consequentially rather than in terms of sacred values. Okay, so these are the three things that I think are most important for beneficial, persuasive conversation. Here's the question of the day. Can AI do that? So let's think about all those three things. So can AI fit the narrative? Can AI describe facts in a way that's consistent with the narrative that its listener has? Couple of points. First of all, AI can certainly tell a story, right? We know that. It already can tell a story, and presumably it'll get better at telling stories. And it can make appropriate background assumptions, so it can frame things in terms of characters and motivations and actions, which is what you need in order to tell a story, in order to create a narrative. I do think at this point it doesn't personalize those narratives, or at least the systems I've seen so far don't personalize those narratives. But I don't see any, so meaning that it gives me the same narrative that it gives my daughter, right? Or that it gives my mother. I don't think that that's intrinsic to AI, but it is a place that it's going to have to go if it's going to be persuasive. Second, I said you have to acknowledge other sacred values. I don't see a problem with AI doing that. I just asked ChatGPT this morning at 3:30 a.m. To list the sacred values for a couple of familiar categories like Democrat and policeman. And it did great, right? So for Democrat, it said like social justice and pro-environment and things that really are important to Democrats. And for policemen, it said sense of duty and keeping people safe and things that presumably are sacred values for policemen. I haven't interviewed policemen, I don't know for sure. One interesting question is, if you merge these categories, right, if you work at the intersection of these categories, if you ask what a democratic policeman's sacred values would be, in this case it actually did okay. Like the first sacred value that it gave was building trust in the community for a democratic policeman, which I thought was reasonable. When I put democratic Olympic athlete, it sort of broke down, right? It didn't know what to say. So it's on the way with number 2. Number 3, I argued you should talk in terms of consequences rather than sacred values. Well, AI has no problem with that, right? It can talk consequentialism better than most human beings, perhaps all human beings, if you think about being able to do so broadly about any issue. So let me end with this. I do think right now AI is too much about filling knowledge deficits, right? That it sees itself, for the most part, as giving people the facts and theories sometimes that they need in order to understand something. What it fails to do so far is to make contact with people's social identities. But I don't see that as an in-principle stumbling block. I think that, it's improving, or I shouldn't say improving, getting better in that way all the time. So it has real potential to frame issues that foster cooperation. Will it do that? I don't know. Is it going to ratchet the culture wars up or down? I think it could do either. And it's really a function of who ends up controlling and regulating it. So we should keep our eyes wide open. Thanks.
Solid state.